All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. This webinar is being recorded. My name is Joanne Kudrevich. I'm the chair of the Cultivation Committee for CANY, the Cannabis Association of New York. And we have some of the authors of the white paper on Aspergillus that included recommendations to New York State for testing requirements. I'd like to just share that this Aspergillus as an issue for cultivators was something our committee had started to speak about when Daniela Vergara came to us with similar concerns as she travels around the state speaking to farmers and cultivators. Bill Nichols is a director at BioTrax Labs, and he is on our cultivation committee. And so he was an integral part of this conversation within our group. And with an introduction to Daniela and others who were then included into the committee or the subcommittee, the white paper was born. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Daniela. You can please speak to a little bit to who you are, what you do, how this came about, and then I'd like the others on the other authors of the white paper to introduce themselves, those who are here. And then we'll go ahead and open it up to questions once we understand a little more about what it is. So Daniela.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Joanne. I'm not muted, okay, because I'm usually muted. So thank you very much for organizing this. It was a pleasure to write this white paper along with Seth, Tim, Bill, Brandy. It was really a nice group, and I'm missing our weekly meetings. So I think this started because of the issues that cultivators were facing with Aspergillus. And Aspergillus, I want to clarify that Aspergillus is a genus of multiple fungi species, right? And there's mainly 4 species that are problematic. There's actually a 5th one that no one tests for that is also problematic, but mostly 4 different species of this genus of fungi. And everyone was failing. And so people were like, hey, we're failing and we don't know what to do. And so I know that there was an OCM meeting in Buffalo where Bill and Brandy were at, and I don't remember if Tim was there or not, but in any case, we started talking about, okay, what is it that we're gonna do? And I know that Joanne was there and Carrie was there too. And we just started talking about it. And then Bill was the one that said, okay, we can bring Seth on board. And I don't know how Tim came on board, but in any case, we all were writing towards the same goal, right? Okay, what is it that we know and how is it that we can help cultivators, and what is it that we can suggest to the OCM on how to tackle this different species of Aspergillus, which could be problematic for human health. They could be, right? Aspergillosis is a thing, and people do get aspergillosis, but mostly people that are immunocompromised or have other health issues like diabetes, or are under immunosuppressants. And so what we did is that we looked at the scientific evidence and we wrote some suggestions from different perspectives, right? Like I am the emerging crop specialist at Cornell Cooperative Extension, and I've been a cannabis scientist since 2013. And then, Bill works at BioTrax, and Tim is a cultivator, and Seth works at No Wave. So we had different perspectives, and Brandy also runs a testing facility, and that's how we came together.
Thank you. Bill, do you want to share, Bill or Seth or Tim, would you like to share a little about yourself and how you came to this, or what?
Sure, I can go first if you
Bill.
like.
Sure.
So, I mean, Danielle kind of summed it up. This has been an item or something that we've been trying to tackle or talking about on the cultivation committee for a while, which I was invited to some while back, I guess 6 months ago now it's been. But it's not just new to the cultivation committee. Obviously, as a director at BioTrax, we do quite a bit of Aspergillus testing. The data from this is actually from our lab and our lab results, but it's a sticking point for customers. We know that the majority of the failures in New York State is Aspergillus. There's more exact numbers to that couldn't be quoted in the paper because they're not officially published yet. But you're talking about over 50% of the failures being Aspergillus alone. So it's, again, obviously we're not policymakers, but this is our recommendations from having such a large breadth of individuals who get to be part of the community on a daily basis, such as myself. And as Daniela said, it was also trying to bring in everyone through all walks of life here. And these branches stem further even than the committee members and the writers of this, because all of us kind of had our tendrils out talking to people in other states and other members of our community here in New York State and such. So it's really a conglomerate of a lot of minds put together and trying to come up with solutions that obviously aren't what everybody would want, but I don't think there's a perfect solution for everybody with this, but we're trying to find relief now, not later. I think is the biggest thing. And then also there are pieces in there about aerobic bacteria and yeast and mold, because we do know that there are going to be people, or that the state is looking to put numbers there too. And if you look at the numbers that we presented, those could end up being problematic for cultivators and whatnot within the state as well.
Great, thank you, Bill. And Bill, if you sit down or move your camera up, we'll be able to see your whole face. Tim.
Yes, but then it's the white halo.
There you go. I love it.
It's shiny enough.
So Tim, Tim was also on our cultivation committee, and then now he's the chair of the Veterans Committee for CANY, but he had a lot of input on the Aspergillus issue and concern for cultivators when we were speaking, and I had suggested he join your group. So Tim, would you like to share a little about why or how or what your interest is in this and what you contribute?
Yeah, well, so I am a small AUC cultivator, and I grow organic, regenerative. I make my own compost. That's the only supplement that I use in my growing. So Aspergillus and me are old friends, kind of, because the act of composting organic matter tends to produce a lot of Aspergillus. But the way I came to this, and Joanne and Bill were good enough to put me on the panel after I asked them. My background is I spent 21 years in the Army and another 17 years or so in defense and in ag technology development, a lot of it dealing with qPCR. But one of the things that we always did in the military and coming up with any kind of a requirement was examining what is the actual threat. And when you look at the actual threat of Aspergillus, it is extremely low for anybody with a functioning immune system, or if they don't have cystic fibrosis or something like that. And so that knowledge, combined with hearing about the struggles of fellow cultivators, really motivated me to want to come in and give my perspective as somebody who had been a defensive systems developer and feeling the pain of those failed Aspergillus tests and the incredibly expensive remediation costs that are involved. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim, for your time and your service. So Seth.
Yeah, so hi. So I'm the chemist for No Wave LLC in Rochester. We're a manufacturer and a processor and a pretty big co-packer. So we work both with anybody wanting to make a product. We work with a lot of cultivators. We interface directly with shops and card holders. And so with that as a perspective, I was brought in by Bill. I'd been talking with Brandy and Daniela for a while prior. And much like Tim, I've seen a lot of the pain that comes with Aspergillus testing, whether it's a cultivator failing and me having to give them the bad news that I'm sorry, that very nice bud you have has to be turned into gummies now, or vape cartridges, or otherwise made into a lower yield product. It's never a fun conversation to have. And figuring out where we can kind of make it acceptable to get some of those Aspergillus positives into the market is a big goal of mine.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you all for your service, and also for the others who are not here tonight on the webinar, but who contributed to the paper. So I'd like to, let me just, as a cultivator, as an AUCC, and as chair of the committee for cultivators, let me start with the pain point, which is for us, is it dangerous? Is this, now, Tim, you said it's very, very low risk, right? So is it or is it not? Because it seems that the testing requirements as they are now are somewhat onerous from our perspective, right? So what's the health and safety issue here, or is there not one?
I'll
Go ahead, Tim, and then I'll go. Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you, Daniela. Yeah, so the CDC lists Aspergillus as an opportunistic pathogen, and that modifier opportunistic is really important. There are a lot of things out there. If your immune system shuts down, just about any bug out there will make a lunch out of you. But if you have a functioning immune system, then you're going to be resistant to these things. In fact, one of the treatments for Aspergillus is a bacterium called Bacillus subtilis, but that's also an opportunistic pathogen. So, just to give you an idea of what your risk is. And plus, Aspergillus is all around us pretty much all the time. So we're constantly inhaling it at this kind of chronically low level, but we're not dying. So that is important to keep in mind. There are people, however, and we acknowledge this in the white paper, and I think Daniela will probably talk to it, is there are people who, if you're an organ transplant recipient, you're going to be on some pretty heavy immune suppressors, and possibly you could be infected with Aspergillus and suffer aspergillosis, the resulting disease. So we acknowledge that, and we have a recommendation for it. And at that point, I'll turn it over to Daniela.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree that there's a risk with everything, right? Every time there's a risk in anything that every decision that you make. But and I think, something that we had, I wouldn't say issues, but where we was kind of, what is our recommendation going to be? Because I feel that I am the most, or maybe Tim and I, kind of the most controversial, because in my opinion, and this is an opinion mine, right? I think Aspergillus should not be tested at all. I think it's a waste of money and a waste of time, because if we test our hands right now, and your hands and everyone's, it's probably there, right? So in my opinion, it's like, why? And then the way that it's tested, right? It's PCR and it's presence absence. And if you're testing for something that is always there, then, well, everyone's gonna fail, right? And in my opinion, and again, this is my opinion, and I wanna make clear right now that I am speaking for me, I think that it's a nonsensical, right? It doesn't make sense. Like, we're gonna test for something that's always there, therefore you're gonna fail. So and right now, as Bill said, we are also talking to other states that are in a similar situation. And there's other states that cultivators are very angry, because I feel that these regulations are not based on a lot of information or a lot of what's there in the scientific knowledge, right? So something that we do, and I try to be very honest about it. Yes, aspergillosis is a thing. Aspergillus does produce some, it could be very harmful, but for whom and when, right? And in what amounts? And it is very different that if you have one spore, or if you have non-viable spores on a PCR test, which is what currently is going on in New York State, it doesn't tell you whether it's viable or non-viable. And besides that, and Bill can speak more about it, we do test for the toxins that Aspergillus produces. So are we obliging people to test for something that first doesn't make sense, and second, maybe we're also testing for the toxins? Then are we spending money in something that we shouldn't be spent? So yes, so we did have some sort of emails that were like, okay, wait a second, where are we standing, and what does, and I do think that maybe Tim and I are the most radical, because I was like, well, let's just not test for it. Like, why are we testing for it? And then it was like, no, let's, like, that may be a very kind of radical idea. Let's just do something that makes more sense and suggest something that makes more sense. And then, like, democracy, and we accepted. But that's my where I stand is just like, I think that this doesn't make sense.
There's a couple of questions that come up for me, and I will ask and put in the chat that anybody who has questions can feel free to put them in the chat, or let us know if you'd like to share and ask the question by yourself. But this begs two different questions that come to my mind. So I think, what's the natural progression? The question I would have is, for those who might be at a higher risk or immunocompromised, wouldn't medical cannabis be the better option than this? Is what we're doing is adult use, right? So what's the distinction? Is there one between the two? And if there's not, should there be? Or as it relates to this type of testing, if someone would speak to that, please.
Yeah, we discussed that quite a bit. One thing I think you got to remember, and we even spoke as a group early on, like, there's statements of clinical manifestations in that paper, but we also tried to limit it. No one here is a medical doctor, right? So therefore it's hard to make those statements. For me, since Daniela gave her more personal opinion, for me, I'm fine whether it's tested for or not. But yes, there are issues with the PCR piece. Something that I'm happy to have conversations with people beyond this, and I've had conversations with everyone that's here. It was something to remember is whether or not the PCR technique that is being used is taking into account some variety of dealing with errant DNA or dealing with viability of those organisms. Because again, the regulations are for viable organisms, not for non-viable organisms. The problem is even if you had it, and let's take a common example that's happening to a lot of people right now. Let's say you go and you choose to remediate your product with whatever, it doesn't really matter. The problem is you've now lysed those cells and you have exposure of possible DNA that will still pop that PCR. So if your lab isn't taking into account that, then that's something you need to consider when you're choosing labs. And you should be able to ask your lab what that is that they're doing. If they're hiding their protocols and not wanting to talk about them, then maybe that's a consideration you need to make in your business plan.
Did anyone else have anything to add about the adult use versus the medical? Or go ahead, Seth.
Yeah, like Bill said, we did discuss that in depth. And I think there's an assumption that if something is a medical grade product, it has been sufficiently sterilized to be safe for someone who is suffering from some sort of immunocompromised state. We're all aware that one of the first uses for medical cannabis was people undergoing chemotherapy. Chemotherapy is a great way to destroy your immune system. It's what it does. It destroys most things in your body to try and kill the cancer. People undergoing chemotherapy have seen incredible successes in the shrinking of their tumors by smoking cannabis. All sorts of papers about there, many of them anecdotal. But they should be smoking medical grade, because the risk of Aspergillus is very real and something that should be brought up. There's no realistic way to test for how much Aspergillus is in a bud. So there's no point even discussing how much is safe. What's a good limit for it? It's a nonsense question. Assume the answer is it's there. And if you're immunocompromised, you shouldn't be smoking anything but medical grade.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, thank you. Just to build on a few things that Daniela and Seth have also said or has hit on, is there oftentimes is this conflation of medical marijuana and recreational. And a lot of the papers that we looked at, they would do just that. They group two of them together and their conclusions would be one conclusion for two different sets of cannabis. And the recommendation in our paper, I think, makes great sense. because the regulations already set it up so that card dispensaries can have medical marijuana in their place, and vice versa. ROs can have recreational marijuana in their dispensaries. So if somebody comes in and the on-site pharmacist or bud tender or whomever asks, a couple of questions, are you on immunosuppressing drugs, or are you being treated for cancer? Then they can say, well, you need to be limited to just these sets of things. The great thing about this solution is there is no really fiscal impact on the medical marijuana market, no impact on the state and their regulations. It's just a change to the pass-fail criteria in the test regs.
Okay.
So I do want to add something, right? From the papers that we looked at, I've yet to find a paper that shows aspergillosis in a healthy individual, right? And that I think that there are two really, well, I really liked our white paper. I mean, I know I'm kind of biased, but I really liked it. But one of the things that I really like, besides the tables that it was actually Bill that made those tables, which are really good, that shows, like the actual data that is going on in New York State. But besides that is that we are recommending, so first we recommend something to have to adult use, right? And it's a warning. So use this under your own discretion. If you're a medical patient, again, as Tim and Seth were saying, maybe you should look for other modes of consumption or other places to buy your cannabis. So that was one of the things. And the other thing is that we also recommend, we have certain research questions that we need answers to in order to make further recommendations. And these questions, we still do not have answers, right? And there's very important questions. For example, dead spores versus viable spores in your cannabis. How much of a threat is that? Or what happens to long-term consumers? Or should we start doing kind of a colony forming units? And yeah, things that we do not know so far that I think are important in order to really pinpoint the regulations and to make sure that we are regulating medical and recreational in maybe different ways. But again, as Tim was saying, if we're growing on especially certain types of grows that are outdoors, that are using compost and maybe, like Korean natural farming, which is so popular in cannabis, or hugelculture or things like that, that actually incentivizes many fungi, right? And it's all of the soil and living soil and worms and etc. And that's the way that plants have been grown for forever. Now that we're trying to grow indoors, and especially in cannabis, you grow indoors. Why? Because it's been illegal and people have been growing in closets and basements. But plants originally, back 500 million years ago, plants were not grown in basements and closets. That was not the case. So I think that we need to be realistic about many facts. And also because in cannabis, the illicit market, they are not testing their stuff for Aspergillus. And if some of us maybe have consumed products from the illicit markets. So we also need to be realistic about those facts, right? That if we want to have the people from legacy coming into the legal market, we need to make sure that we give room for regulations that allow these people to come in. And the more regulations that you put on your fonts, on your packages, on what you need to test, the more money that you need to put in, and then the more barriers you put for people to come in.
Well said, Daniela. So I would love someone to share, or maybe the group can speak a little bit to what are the testing requirements right now, and what is it that your white paper is recommending in comparison to that? Go ahead, Bill, you're unmuted. Go for it.
No one jump. I mean, so for Aspergillus, as we already mentioned, whether it's medical or adult use, it's pass fail. It's a presence absence. The test itself does have threshold limits to it, so it's not necessarily a net one for whether or not it's present or not. It doesn't quite work like that, but that's kind of the perception that's out there with it. But the other aspects to that then is looking at the yeast and mold and aerobic limits there. But before I get to that, I did want to mention one thing that I think we all found pretty curious about the white paper is in talking about costs to people and whatnot. And that is, if you look at the data, all of the positive results for Aspergillus has not been on a value-added product. It's only been on flower or raw flower products. So that's also something to consider here, because individuals who are making or working with a processor like Seth or something of that nature, who then has to test for that still, that's something that we haven't seen a single positive for yet to it. So is that a consideration? Is there something about the processing aspect of this that removes any viable spores or the organism itself? Certainly the organism itself, but even spores, because if the spores are there, the methods would still gain positives. But I forget the exact number of runs are in that data set. That data set's only for 2023, by the way. But again, we haven't seen any. Second to that, though, goes yeast and mold and aerobic bacteria. There are limits for those individuals now, but not on raw flower. This is what's being proposed to get put into place. My worry and why I brought it up as part of this paper is that we would just be introducing a new failure point for individuals who might be looking at this. If you read the paper, you'll notice that unextracted products for aerobic bacteria, the average is 227,000 CFUs or colony forming units per gram. And then for yeast and mold, it's 37,000 and change for CFUs per gram. And just to give you a comparison to that, the medical side of things for unextracted products for yeast and mold, and for that, you're looking at yeast and mold being around 10,000 CFUs for unextracted products as the limit, and 100,000 for unextracted on the aerobic side of things. So if you match those, and that was about where the numbers were last fall before they decided to suspend those numbers, a good majority of individuals would still possibly fail. And it's even possible that a good majority of our populace would still fail those numbers beyond that. Our recommendation in this paper for yeast and mold and aerobic bacteria on unextracted materials, so raw flour products, whether it be pre-roll or whole flour, was to not change that. My problem is it's fine to know those numbers, and that's great, but general yeast and mold, general aerobic bacteria, those numbers aren't necessarily related, again, back to safety concerns. They're more quality-based numbers. For instance, if you look at other industries that use botanical products as for what they're selling, that again would be a quality-based number, not a pass fail. So therefore that is a concern there, that we would end up failing and having another repeat of what we're dealing with on the Aspergillus side of things.
Okay. Would anyone else like to take that one? Just in terms of what you're recommending to the state as compared to what we're doing now, how you think it might impact or support cultivators or not, because that's the community that we're addressing here specifically, and or how it might affect the supply chain.
I think Bill really nailed it there. I'd like to put it in brief for cultivators especially. Test Aspergillus, don't have it be a pass-fail, stick it on the COA, let the customer make an informed choice. That's the whole of the recommendation, and maybe distance the medical regs from the recreational regs just a little bit more clearly.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay. So I guess, I've put in the chat for anyone who is present in the webinar to put their questions there if they have any. What else in the meantime, since I haven't had any takers, is there anyone here on the panel, those of you who authored this and who, I followed the email chain. So I saw the back and forth going on for weeks and weeks on end, as someone who helped participate, bringing you all together. So I'm just curious if there's anything else you think that maybe I read about throughout this process that those in the panel or that the white paper may or may not reflect. Is there anything that is left to be shared or said? And I guess another question I have is, I know that a lot of different groups have put this out there into communities. I myself sent it to the folks I was asked to send it to at the OCM. And we'll be following up later this week to find out where we're at, what might be happening with this work that you guys all produced. But I'm curious to see what you think might be the outcome of this, and if there's anything else you'd like to share.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
Speaking from a cultivator's perspective, the Aspergillus test is both it's a huge cost to us either way. I mean, pretty much. It's, if you are growing indoors and you can afford all of the environmental controls, then you can probably keep the Aspergillus inside your grow facility down. Again, if you're growing outdoors, and I'm with Daniela, this plant evolved over millions of years to grow in sun and soil, living soil. And, there are other phytochemicals that are going to be in that plant that you won't get in a plant that's grown in a defined medium. But and a lot of us are passionate about that. We believe that that's the way the plant should be grown. But the cost, our margin as a cultivator is so narrow. And a lot of people don't seem to understand this. But if you look at the breakdown of who gets what, and say you buy $100 worth of cannabis, $50 is going to go to the retail dispensary. Typically around $33 will go to the processor. Out of that remaining $27, the farmer will get $3 or $4 of profit, assuming he doesn't have a failed lot. If he has a failed lot, well, that can be a pretty significant investment and revenue loss that he or she can't make up. So, along with the potency tax, I think Aspergillus is certainly, if not the top two, among the top 5 concerns for every cannabis cultivator. In fact, Oregon, I think Daniela sent the article about the Oregon cannabis growers levying a suit against the state for over Aspergillus testing. Currently, they don't have it, but the state is proposing it.
Great, thanks, Tim. Seth, I know you wanted to share something.
Yeah, just regarding the outcomes. I'm not one to hold my breath when it comes to the OCM making decisions. Based off of all our discussion, I think the only very likely decision they are to make is to eliminate the testing requirement for value-added and processed cannabis goods, which does still impact the cultivator. The Wave works with many cultivators in making brands for them, converting flower directly to gummies, vape carts, what have you. So there is still some value to be gained from that, but that's the only very likely outcome I see. It may well take a lawsuit to get rid of the pass-fail requirements for Aspergillus. Wouldn't be the first time, wouldn't be the last.
Okay, thank you. Daniela?
I am sorry to hear what Seth just said, because I was holding my breath, I was like, this is gonna make an impact. And because look, when I looked at a bunch of papers on remediation in berries, which, they do it kind of as a preventative measure. It's not like we're going to test, it's just like everything's going to get remediated. And so I feel like I understand that especially New York State is under everyone is looking at New York State. And I understand that the OCM wants to have, wants to make, the best and because everyone is scrutinizing, I think that they're under a lot of stress. But I do think that cannabis is being, it has a different bar, right? Tobacco does not have the high bar that we are having right now. Not even food has that high bar. And I think that at the end of the day, having that very stringent testing and that very high bar is going towards cultivators, and cultivators are the ones that are taking the biggest hit. And I know that the OCM is talking about it. I don't know what the outcomes are going to be. And for me, again, I know that I have the most radical opinion of all, but I would be happy with the OCM saying we're going to have a threshold. Because if you have a threshold, that makes it more realistic, right? That makes it very realistic in a sense that, okay, we know that it's there, but you don't want something, you don't want it a lot. You want some because it's always there. And again, it's also the OCM's rules. And there's a lot of people from the OCM that I really like, and I hope that they're not listening. But again, if they had opened dispensaries when they said that they were going to open dispensaries, this would be less of a problem, because then you can get rid of your flower quicker. If the people, the bud tenders, instead of opening and closing and look at this joint, instead of touching it, if they just had something to show instead of something, right, that would be easier, that would be better. So again, I think that there's a lot of regulations that they could put in place that could help, that not necessarily has a presence absence, because again, a presence absence, it's you're destined to fail. And maybe remediation can become a thing for at least a segment of the population, maybe for medical patients, for example, that you always have remediated material, right? So maybe that could be like, again, for berries, everything is remediated as a preventative measure. So I hope that maybe a threshold could be a thing, and maybe what Bill and Seth or Tim said, that for material, that gummies or things that go through processing, that doesn't need to be tested. That's a waste of money and time. So why are we testing that? So I hope that those things do happen.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of you for the work. I know how much time, energy, effort went into the white paper and all of the conversations and communications. And we truly appreciate it on behalf of our community. There are swaths of our cultivators who have been dramatically and drastically affected by this testing, these testing requirements. And it's heartbreaking, truly. So we very much appreciate all the efforts that you've put into this, and we will do our best. I, in my position with CANY, and I know our organization will do our best to keep pushing this agenda forward. Is there any last minute words of wisdom or thoughts that you'd like to impart before we close this? And remember that this is being recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel for others to enjoy later on, including the OCM.
I guess one last thing. Daniela triggered a thought when she was talking about maybe putting a limit on it. Going back to something she said earlier on, is we still have the mycotoxin test. And back earlier to something I said, we need to know, before you set a requirement, you need to know what the infectious dose or effective dose is of whatever you're concerned with. Well, we don't have that for Aspergillus, because as Daniela said, if you're an average, reasonably healthy person, you're not going to get aspergillosis. There hasn't been any record of it anyhow. So it's we recommended a number of studies, but one thing, and I don't think we got this in there because it kind of dawned on me late, but is mycotoxin enough as an indirect threat for Aspergillus? Because Aspergillus produces at least some of those toxins that are listed in the current requirements. Maybe that's enough, and maybe some more research into is that enough or not would be useful.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Go ahead, Bill. You're chomping at the bit. Go for it.
Well, no, a few things. I don't disagree, Tim, that obviously mycotoxins are a little bit more well known. There's more known about them because also within the food realm, unlike talking about aspergillosis, which is usually an inhalable disease, it's not a GI disease. Mycotoxins can bioaccumulate, so we know a little bit more about them. I think, though, to realize, though, a threshold limit that is being talked about here on the lab practicality part, and I know I've brought this up in our meetings, is not as practical as it's being made out to be. Without significantly more investment, which causes its own problems. I know I've been told in the past by select individuals, oh, people would pay a little bit more. They don't want to pay anymore. I can tell you the majority does not want to pay anymore. So like that's not necessarily a direct manner, which is why I keep bringing up the viability thing. I mean, I've literally run stuff from people that have failed 3, 4, 5 times from other labs. And then I tested it with the same material that they took from that lab back, and then it came out negative. Why is that? Why is one place getting a positive and another's not? There's more to this to try to help save some of those numbers than just pass fail. If you look in the quality manual, it doesn't have a viability checking step in it. And that's the manual that is kind of the governing piece for laboratories in New York State, right? And we are going to get more data from other states. Oregon just filed a lawsuit a week ago, my time's merging. At this point, I think it's a week and a half ago at this point. So we're going to see change to it and hoping to continue to be a part of that. But, again, it has to be a compromise between making it more making realistic regulations, but also making it affordable enough to balance it. Luckily, we're not the ones that have to make those decisions. We're just the ones that deal with the aftermath, unfortunately, of those. But I think the one thing I think we all agreed upon is the space. It's talking about the differences within our group, and you're seeing some of those come out. I think the one thing we can all agree upon, and everyone will probably shake their head yes to, even the individuals not here, is more research needs to be done in this space, right? I think that's something that not a single one of us disagreed about. With it, my thing is that I'm always looking at not only making testing better, but also finding ways of making it more affordable as well. And as we add more tests, more regulations, and more analytes, that's not making it affordable for anybody.
Yeah. Thank you. Go ahead, Seth.
To play off something Bill said there, false positives are a problem. So are false negatives. Aspergillus is not some magically evenly distributed spore and organism. There'll be hot spots and cold spots. There'll be a bud that could be loaded with Aspergillus while the rest of the field is practically clear. A negative test result is, and this is to the OCM, a negative test result is kind of misleading to the customer. It's one good test. That doesn't mean what they are smoking is clean. And I think that needs to be taken into account. I think just assuming everything recreational is Aspergillus positive is a safe assumption. It's certainly the safe one for customers. So what are we doing?
Under that assumption, the medical's the same. If you are immune compromised, there are other routes to take your cannabinoids in that can still help you that doesn't include smoking and are truthfully safer for those individuals.
I agree.
Need to consider a tincture or whatever. I mean, we can name a million things, but
alternatively, given that there are studies that show that the various byproducts of smoking are different cannabinoids, things that do not exist naturally in the plant, but may still perform some medical benefit, we don't know. We cannot claim either way. having a requirement for remediated bud, having a requirement of a very specific one. It must see this concentration of ozone in this size of a space for this amount of time. It must see this wavelength of UV at this intensity in a single layer for this amount of time. We need those regulations for the medical space because that's where you have to keep people safe.
Right. And I mean, the medical side, like, I don't want to suggest anything for the medical side. I don't think that I am qualified to say anything about the medical side, although I think that Seth brings really good points. But when I see a negative Aspergillus COA, I start questioning, right? It's kind of like, did you remediate, right? Because it should be, it's everywhere, right? So when I see a negative test, is like, okay, what's going on, right? Did you remediate or what happened? So yes, there are hot spots and cold spots, but Aspergillus is found everywhere, and if you have a PCR test, it should be positive, right? So I think that is, it's the other way around for me, right? I kind of like, wait, what's going on when I see a COA with a complete negative presence absence PCR test? So I do think that yeah, the presence absence is nonsensical. It just, at least that one, you're gonna test, but at least not that way. Test somehow else. And then the medical patients, there's other ways of consumption, like Bill was saying.
Well, great. Thank you. Thank you for your time, for putting the paper together. Thank you for your time tonight to answer some of these questions and to explain it further. And like I said, this will be on the YouTube channel for anyone who has not been able to make it tonight, so that they can view it later on. And I will stay in touch as I continue my advocacy for your work, and would love to hear from you if anything comes from your end as well. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll catch up with you next time. Go ahead, Daniela.
Yeah. So field day in Cornell is on Thursday. It's gonna be in Geneva. I hope to see you guys there. I know that Geneva may be far from some of you, but I hope that for the ones that at least are nearby, to make it on Geneva.
I'm gonna, before I end this, Chad Burns put a question in. When you say PCR, do you mean small q PCR?
I think that some labs have qPCR. I mean, the quantitative PCR, it does give you a sense of how much DNA there is.
Correct.
So I think that that's a good question, but at the end of the day, DNA is how much DNA there is there, if there's any, is it viable or non-viable? I do think that that's a good question, but I don't know who or if labs test PCR or just qPCR. I don't know. Bill could answer that.
Most methods are qPCR, but yes. And there are other methods out there too for speciation, Malditoff and things. But again, some of these ways are more pricey, right? This goes back to my money situation. And to me, it's not just about making regulations that are quote unquote safer or better, but it's also making sure that price is incorporated to part of this as well, so we can bring those testing price points down.
All right. Once again, thank you guys, truly, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you, Joanne.